Hey everybody, it's the Ambassador. Got a brand new video for you all today, and this is going to be another entry in our 80s pop culture series. And we're going to cover a topic that I have actually been kind of chomping at the bit to um, discuss with you all, and it's honestly a topic I'm very passionate about. I know quite a bit about on it, and it's one that I think honestly when you think of the 1980s, that decade, everything, you think of the advent of the music video genre and just 80s music in general. And you honestly cannot talk about the 1980s if you don't at least cover in part and everything the music landscape of that decade, not to mention the advent of the music video, because up until that point, the whole concept, the whole art form of the music video, one second, was not a widely known or widely done thing. The closest thing you had to the music video or any type of music and visual medium was the theatrical musical or the movie musical. And with the 1980s, you had this absolute explosion of the music scene and everything, and in particular, all these different artists that were coming out at the time with these very inventive, very odd, at times, music videos. And obviously, a key component of the music scene of the 1980s was the creation of MTV. And for those of you who might be too young and everything to know a time before MTV as it is today, one of the key things about MTV was the music that they played, the VJs, the video DJs that they had and everything. They would do intros on the different videos. They would do interviews with the major pop stars or just musicians of the time, like Madonna, Michael Jackson, Boy George, Def Leppard, Duran Duran, Aerosmith. Now, obviously, some of these guys, some of these bands and everything, some of these musicians had careers before the 80s, but some of them really hit it big in the 80s, and in particular with the music videos that they did at the time. And honestly, I grew up, obviously, as I've mentioned before, I grew up in the 1980s, and the music of that decade, of that era, was so different. It was like anything we had heard before. I mean, I grew up in a home where we listened to a lot of music from the 1950s, the 1960s, the 70s, even classical music or anything like on like your big bands from the 1930s and 40s and everything. And I grew up in a very eclectic home and everything when it came to music, because my mother and father, they grew up in the 1940s and 1950s, which was honestly a big time for music and everything. And music is one of those things that every generation tries to identify or tries to establish its identity through the music that is made and is produced and everything at the time. And that's still true even to today, because the older generation is going to say, "Oh, that's all that is just noise," and I can imagine that was very very much the case and everything for the older generations and the younger generations, everything that existed and everything during the 1980s. You had all this different type of music. You had rock, you had pop, you had synth, electronic or electric, everything, and it was just, you name it, there was something for you to listen to in terms of the music of the 80s. And but the incredible thing was you had these artists who started to do music videos. And like I mentioned, up until that point, this was a completely new medium. This was something completely different that we had not seen before. Everything. I think the closest thing you had to a music video before the explosion of pop and rock music videos was probably when Elvis Presley did the movie Jailhouse Rock, and that was kind of a music video in a way, but it was a much longer film. I think it was honestly a film and everything. Probably was one of Elvis Presley's earliest movies that he did. But what you had in the 80s was you had these bands coming out and everything, and a lot of them were what they called a one hit wonder, and that's still something that's common today, even. And I think because you had bands like the B-52s and Devo and um, Boy George and all these other guys and everything. It's impossible to list or anything. Dire Straits. Now, obviously, Dire Straits was not a one hit wonder because they had quite a few big hits or anything in the 80s, and they've still toured until this day. And then you had the older bands and everything that had been around for a while, like in the 70s and so on, like with Fleetwood Mac and so on. And they caught on to the whole music video craze and everything, and they're like, okay, this is something new, this is something different, so let's get on board this thing and let's see what we can do with it and everything. Um, and honestly, we got some really cool, really inventive, really different music videos and everything in that decade. And I am going to post something down in the description and everything. It is a link to a playlist of mine and everything that I really and everything that I've built over time. Now it is primarily music videos from the 80s, but there is some stuff from the 90s and the 2000s and everything in there as well. But just to kind of give you all an idea of how the music video has evolved starting in the 80s and moving forward and everything. And this playlist of mine, it's got some of the greats and everything in there. You've got Billy Idol, you got Robert Palmer, you got oh, good grief. um, I think I've got some Green Day, and the list just goes on and on. Peter Gabriel and everything. If y'all aren't familiar with him and everything, he was a big name in the 80s and the 90s and everything. And one of the videos on there is actually called Sledgehammer. It is honestly one of the most visually interesting music videos I've ever come across. I actually remember watching it on MTV and everything when I was growing up and everything, particularly in the 90s and everything. They would rerun it and everything periodically. But the great thing about the music of the 80s is it had a very unique sound. It was like nothing we had heard before. And it really, everything, it could make you laugh, it could make you cry, it could evoke feelings and everything of all sorts and everything. But it was always visually stunning. It was always visually interesting. And I think for every band or just individual singer and everything, they were trying to find their own style, find their own unique flavor and everything that they wanted to bring to their videos. And you very much can sense this and see it and everything in the videos and everything. And the other interesting thing is, as time went on, these music videos evolved from just a simple video and everything where they were putting visuals to the music, where they were actually trying to tell a story, which honestly, with a lot of music videos, a lot of songs were almost a story and everything, a very miniaturized, very compact story, like almost a mini movie, obviously. And I think the best representation we have of that is, and this is an iconic music video and everything, is Michael Jackson's Thriller. And I think for those of you, obviously, who know the guy and everything, I think one of the most iconic, or some of the most iconic music videos from the 80s were done by Michael Jackson, because you had Thriller, you had Billie Jean and everything with the invention of the moonwalk, you had Smooth Criminal, and all these other videos that Michael Jackson had done in the 1980s. And I know on the personal side of his life, there were some issues and everything, but if you just want to look at the man as a pure artist, he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And this was true and everything because everybody was trying to get a leg up on everybody else in terms of the type of music videos and the type of music they were producing. And honestly, that was something that was very intriguing for the era. And for me, music has always been a very important part of my life and everything because my father was a musician. He instilled in me an appreciation and a love for music and everything because while he didn't play in a band or anything, he was a very gifted and a very talented musician and everything. You could play any type of instrument in front of him and he could play it. He could sing like a bird. My father had a very beautiful singing voice and everything. And the one thing that he instilled in me was a love and appreciation for good musicians and for good music. And the 1980s gave us some really, honestly, some good music, some very iconic music, some very iconic music videos that have lasted to this day. And honestly, as I've said, you cannot talk about the landscape, the pop culture landscape of the 1980s if you don't discuss the music. And I think honestly that is true for every decade prior and now, is that music is the lifeblood of society. And I honestly, firmly, very truly believe that. And the great thing about the music of the 1980s, it is iconic. It has stood the test of time. It is something that speaks to every person, regardless of race, gender, background, whatever. It doesn't matter. Because we all key on music. We all identify with a particular artist or music genre. It doesn't really matter and everything because you can find something that you're going to love that's going to speak to you personally. And that honestly is a wonderful and beautiful thing. So, but I think, truthfully, aside from movies and TV shows, and I'm honestly going to do probably one of the next installments on my 1980s series, I'm going to do our TV shows, sitcoms, cartoons, and anything, whatever, of the 1980s or anything. But I think one of the major key elements of the 1980s pop culture landscape was the music. And as I've said, it spoke to me personally and anything. And I think that's true for all of us, whether we grew up in the 1980s or we came up after. Because this is something that we pass on to the younger generations, is our appreciation and our love of these great videos, of this great music from that decade and everything. And it's something that has become truly timeless. And it's something that's rarely available, particularly now. And if you think about it, at this period in history, every generation prior to us and every generation that's coming up now has access to music from so many time periods and so many different formats and forms and styles and genres of music because you have things like YouTube, you have things like your iPhone and iPod and specifically the iTunes store, where you can download music digitally, and you can find music readily from every decade and everything that has been preserved or has been made in the last, well, you could almost make the argument the last 100 years or so, or at least the last 50 to 60 years when music started to be recorded, and they have gone back and they have done digital remasters or digital uploads of these old forms of music. And I think the great thing about the 80s was the fact that you finally had this melding of the audio and visual mediums and everything into something that was honestly very, very cool and very, very unique and very distinctive of that decade. And it has caused such an explosion of creativity in the years since then. Because even today we have honestly great music videos that have become iconic within just the last, since the 2000s have started. We've had great music videos been produced, and these people that have done these artists, these singers and everything, have been inspired by the musicians of the past. So, but that being all said, I hope I've given you all a pretty good idea of what the music scene was in the 1980s, how much it has impacted our society and our pop culture to this day. Everything. If you enjoyed this video, and I hope you did, I know I'm loving doing these videos for you all. I'm love bringing this aspect of the 1980s to you and everything. As always, if you are new to my channel, welcome. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, by all means, give it a like. Share it with your friends. If you've got any additional thoughts or anything, by all means, comment down below. If you want to contact me, you can do so on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Rogue5778. Rogue, just like Rogue Squadron or Rogue from X-Men. R-O-U-G-E. Yeah, R-O-U-G-E. So, but until next time, my friends, this is the Ambassador, signing off.